Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Martin, and it's my privilege to serve as ECFA's president and welcome you to today's webinar as we present ECFA State of Giving 2020. Whether you're with us live today or tuning in to the recorded webinar on demand, we appreciate you setting aside this time to invest in your learning and leadership. And again, our topic for today is the annual ECFA State of Giving update, based on our report just released by Dr. Warren Byrd and our team. But today's webinar goes beyond even the historic trends that we would typically cover in our usual State of Giving. Thanks to help from thousands of you responding to our recent surveys on the financial impacts of COVID-19 during this unique season of ministry, we'll also be discussing the latest real-time trends that we're seeing in 2020 giving, staffing, cash reserves, and more. We've titled the bonus material today, Defying the Odds, Giving Grows Despite the Pandemic. This is such an important and timely topic. You're about to hear this just released information by ECFA that I hope will shape both your perspective and your planning as you look towards 2021. But before I go any further, let me formally open us in a time of prayer and ask the Lord's blessing on our time together. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time that we have to share today over the webinar. Thank you for the hundreds that have joined us today to participate. God, we are so grateful for just the many ways in which you have miraculously provided for your ministry to continue, even during the challenges of a year like we've had. And so, God, we are grateful for all of those blessings. We're grateful for all the leaders who are represented on today's webinar. Thank you for their faithfulness and all the givers as well who've continued to be good stewards and make ministry possible this year. Lord, we pray your blessing on this time together, that you would just continue to give us wisdom as we lead and look to these next days that are ahead. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, joining me today is ECFA's Vice President of Research and Equipping, Dr. Warren Byrd. Warren brings his professional expertise to heading our research efforts here at ECFA, and today he'll be providing insights both on ECFA's State of Giving 2020 and on ECFA's 2020 Survey of Giving throughout this pandemic timeframe. Warren is a former pastor, seminary professor, and author or co-author of 33 books for ministry leaders. In 2020, he somehow found time to co-author books on pastoral succession and on healthy mergers. Warren's recent ECFA research projects include Megachurch 2020, a huge study of America's largest attendance churches, and Unleashing Your Board's Potential. One version for nonprofit boards and another version for church boards. You can see the free download links on the slide. Well, Warren, it is great to have you here in our offices in the studio to present this webinar today, and in 2020 fashion, of course, at a safe social distance.
Well, thank you. And if you're going to say such nice things about me, let me affirm my relief that you are both a CPA and an attorney, not to mention ECFA's former executive vice president and now ECFA's president since March 2020. And I say that's a relief to me because maybe during our Q&A, I can toss the really hard questions to you.
Well, I guess we'll see about that because the questions come to me. So I guess maybe I'll throw the tough ones your way. But Warren, I know we have some big news and folks are investing some of their time today in this webinar. So let's just jump right into it. What is the big news that we have today?
Thanks, Michael. ECFA does have big news today, and it comes in two parts. First, what giving patterns do we see over the last 5 and 10 years? And second, what are the giving patterns in 2020 and giving projections into 2021?
Perfect. So yeah, we have a lot to cover from both of those time frames. So why don't we just start at the top then with historical patterns that take us up through 2019?
Over the last 10 years, we came out of the Great Recession, and for 9 of the last 10 years, giving to ECFA members has gone up, even after adjusting for inflation. For the last 5 years, the inflation-adjusted annualized growth in cash giving to ECFA members is 2.5%. If you look at the most recent complete year, 2019, the inflation-adjusted growth in cash giving to ECFA members is 1.5%. That is, in 2019, donors gave 1.5% more to ECFA members than in 2018, even after adjusting for inflation. So one more time, the big news from this first section of the webinar is positive. Cash giving to ECFA members continues to grow.
Good. Well, it's always good to start with some good news, and especially during times like these, that's really good news. These positive gains in giving really over 9 of the last 10 years are very encouraging. But maybe could you clarify for those that are viewing, what exactly is it that we're measuring? And then also, why does it matter to them? I think those are the key questions. All the slides that we've been showing come from the ECFA State of Giving 2020 report. And I know people can read that in their own time in more detail, but maybe just during these next few minutes together, Warren, what if you walk us through the survey and provide the coaching that only you can on how each of the findings can be practically used by the more than 2,500 ECFA members, and also by many of our friends who are also tuning in with us today?
Sure. Each year, our report gets better because the more Christ-centered nonprofit ministries and churches who become ECFA members, the more data we get to crunch. For this year's report, we looked at just over $14 billion in cash giving to ECFA members. Whatever ministry or church our listeners represent, it may be helpful to divide your annual revenue into 3 pie slices. The first is cash giving. That's checks, online giving, actual green stuff, and the like. That cash giving slice of the pie is what our report focuses on. Now, there's also non-cash giving, such as gifts in kind and donated services. And the final slice is other income. So that might include program fees, investments, or other things. So now, armed with that knowledge about your ministry or church, now compare it to Table 1, where we show those 3 pie slices for more than 30 different types of ministry plus other. Suppose, for example, your ministry is a pregnancy center. According to this research, 85% of income to pregnancy centers comes from cash giving. But suppose your pregnancy center's cash giving percentage is much lower. You might ask yourself, what are they doing that we're not doing? Or what do they know that we don't know? You can go to ECFA's website, search under the Find Members tab for a list of pregnancy centers, and contact 2 or 3 about your size to do some peer learning. Pray together, talk together, learn from them.
Awesome. No, that's a great encouragement. Should we just stop the webinar there? I think that gives us all enough homework to get started. But no, I'm just reflecting too, Warren, on what you shared. It's really amazing, the variety of the just different types of income, the mixes that we're seeing by those 30 plus types of ministries that you mentioned, Warren, that are presented there on Table 1. For children's homes, for example, a little lower on the list, I see that only about 28% of their income on average would come from cash giving. So just looking at the different varieties that we have there, there's a wide variety of benchmarks. And I think too, Warren, that really represents and speaks to the great diversity that we have within ECFA's members.
Indeed. But onward to table number 2, which likewise looks at the percentage change in the cash giving pie slice for each of those 30 plus types of ministry, showing how it changed in recent years. The top row, for example, shows that human trafficking ministries had the highest cash giving increase, 10% annualized over 5 years. How do you, our listeners, use this information most practically? Find the row that most closely represents your ministry. Or, suppose you're a local church, scroll down to churches, individual, and see how your numbers compare to what other ECFA members experienced. If those numbers are really different, try to prayerfully discern why.
No, that's excellent. And coming back to something you said just earlier, make sure that folks didn't miss that. And that is on, the opportunities with our website to find different members, again, that folks can talk with and compare to. So I think that's a great practical tip. Maybe too, Warren, another question would be, how much difference is there when it comes to the size of a ministry or a church? So we've talked about types, but what about size? How does cash giving change by the different revenue levels that are there?
Great question. We got a table for that too. Table 3 offers a breakdown for ministries by 8 different size categories. The first listed are those with annual revenues of $50 million and higher. And the lowest line in the table are those with annual revenue under $500,000. So on this table, ministries with revenues under $1 million went down on average, at least in the 5-year annualized column. And again, all percentages in this report have been adjusted for inflation. Michael, since you throw me questions, do you have any theories as to why cash giving levels vary by ministry size?
Well, I guess it's only fair if I'm sending these questions your way that you have the opportunity to send a few my way.
And readers, we're not going to talk too long. We want your questions too, and we'll come back to that.
Absolutely. And on that point, you can send those again to webinar@ecfa.org as you're listening, as Warren and I are presenting here at the beginning. But no, you had asked a great question. I guess, Warren, what I would say is I'll start by observing that really even outside of the nonprofit sector, this is a very real trend. For example, think about how smaller hardware stores have a hard time keeping up in a Home Depot world. So I think those are certainly part of the reality that we're seeing. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say, Warren, is that one factor at play here within nonprofit ministry is economies of scale. I think the larger that you are, the more resources that you can draw from to help withstand some of the challenging seasons like we've walked through this year and in recent years. And then also mid-size and larger organizations, Warren, I think for better or worse, they're really able to leverage what they've already had. So I think those are just a few of the insights that I would see in terms of your question on why and based on size.
Thanks. Interestingly, our next table shows a similar size breakdown for churches. And here the pattern is different than for nonprofit ministries. In general, the increase in cash giving for churches is slightly less than to nonprofit ministries, both across the last 5 years and also across the most recent year. So that's table 4, and again, you can dig further into that if you'd like to. We had a delightful time putting lots of information out there for you.
Good. Well, maybe let's actually camp there for a bit. I think that's something we ought not look over too quickly. Why do you think it is, Warren, that on the church side, that church giving seems to have been relatively flat?
Our ECFA data doesn't explain the relatively flat giving to churches in recent years, but let me highlight a few factors that I'm aware of. First, churches that are growing tend to have lower per-person giving. Their core members may be tithing wonderfully, but their newcomers, if they're new to the faith, don't yet have that commitment or discipline. Their minimal giving offsets the tithers, and of course, the more you draw the unchurched newcomer, which is what you want to do, which is what the Bible calls us to do, the lower the per capita giving average. Another factor, churches of all sizes are experiencing a decreasing frequency of attendance. And simply put, for most people, the less you attend, whether it's in person or online, the less you give. Another factor, Christians, especially millennials and Gen Z, tend to spread out their charitable giving both to their church and to many other causes.
Good. Well, thanks for the observations there. I might ask you another question too. Hopefully this is fair. And that is, Warren, you do a lot of research in the church space. I know you talk with a lot of folks that are out there. So that's what churches as a whole might be experiencing in terms of some of those obstacles, either with size, and so forth based on attendance. What are some of the churches who are maybe bucking some of those trends, or who have managed to continue to see, different experiences? What are some of them doing that maybe the rest of us can learn from in terms of that?
Churches like that made several shifts, pivots, to use the popular word, during the pandemic. First they immediately pivoted to online, both worship and giving, but that was only the beginning. They pivoted to make sure their members were caring for each other, their regular attenders, that they had online small groups, and as soon as regatherings could occur on any scale, that they were gathering in person, that there were networks of community within the church. But they didn't stop there either. They then figured out, how do we leverage the congregation who is now, meeting each other's needs, serving each other, loving each other, carrying each other, supporting each other? How do we help them do outreach? And so now, as churches went beyond their walls, whether, food giveaways or other ways of caring for the community, or individually challenging each small group, hey, over the next 3 months, we want you to do something to reach out to those in need. You decide as a small group, tell us what support you need. And churches that have mobilized the congregation, which is what Ephesians 4, 11, and 12 are all about to begin with, are the ones who are going to emerge through the pandemic strongly. And of course, engagement and giving are hand in hand. So people whose needs are being met, who are able to serve in Jesus' name, those are the people who, as they have finances, are able to give to the local church they love.
Great. Well, thanks for throwing in a few extra observations there. I thought that was an important one for us to take a few minutes on. I know we've got some more learnings to come, so let's go now to table 5. Like you said, there's a table for everything, so let's go to table 5.
To me, the table we're looking at now is probably the least encouraging news of the report. On the positive side, the annual change in cash giving to ECFA members regularly outpaces similar giving percentages to other areas of religion. However, in this table, we see that cash giving didn't keep up with increases in wage growth over the last decade, nor with the growth of GDP, gross domestic product, nor with the stock market, nor even with giving to all charities combined. One reason that giving to faith-based endeavors doesn't have wide swings up and down, one reason is that faith-based endeavors don't have wide swings up and down like the stock market does. Religious giving tends to change over the years in small increments. And fortunately, those increments are steadily inching upward. Michael, do you want to offer some other reasons why cash giving over the last 5 and even 10 years hasn't kept up with, for example, wage growth?
Sure, yeah. I'll just share a few quick thoughts. I don't know that I can fully tackle that one, but maybe, just a few quick thoughts. I think, actually going back a little bit, I think first historically, and even honestly, to this day, Warren, one thing that we should all remember is actually that Americans are a very generous people. And so that is good news. I think we need to keep that in mind. But no, you're right. The bad news, like you mentioned, is that it does appear that Americans are becoming less generous. If giving levels aren't keeping pace with wage growth, I think one of the things we can see is that Americans' financial habits and their priorities are changing. They're different than what they have been historically as giving has been tracked over the years. And then, Warren, too, I think another point here to observe is that even within the charitable giving pie, if you will, that overall pie, some of the priorities are shifting with fewer that are giving to religion. So those are just a few thoughts in case they're helpful.
Helpful thoughts indeed. Thank you. So let me offer a summary of kind of the concerns in what we've covered so far. As one early reviewer of our report summarized it, the last 4 years have been a tough slog in terms of cash giving. Yes, it's up, but not by too much. And it's not up for everyone. For example, giving to missions is and has been flat. That's not good news for those ministries, or I would say for the expansion of the kingdom of God, our mission. It's a bit surprising that giving to individual churches has been, likewise, relatively flat for the last 2 years. And small ministries, those with less than $1 million annual revenue, continue a long trend of slipping a bit behind the rest. Those are areas of concern that the report brought up. And that's my overview of the historical data featured in ECFA State of Giving 2020. Now, let's shift to year-to-date 2020 and also predictions that our viewers, gave for 2021.
Yes. Well, we'll get right there in a moment. But before we do, Warren, I think this is a good time just to remind folks that, again, we would love, we've appreciated not only your help with this next section that we're about to talk about, which is that real-time trends in terms of financial impact from COVID, but today we would also love to have your questions, and we're going to be taking time at the end of the webinar to answer as many of those as possible. And again, you can email them to webinar@ecfa.org. And actually take just a moment right now to recognize one of the questions that we've already had that came in. And Warren, I think it's good to answer now because it relates to the state of giving and really this content that we've already covered. And the good news is we have our team that are also online as well, answering some of these questions in real time. And so one of the first questions that came in was, in which category do you put stock gifts? And so as our team has already been able to share, but we'll share more broadly, the answer is that publicly held donated marketable securities, those are included in cash contributions. But then on the other hand, privately held securities would be included in other income. So hopefully that's helpful if there's others who had similar questions. But again, send those questions to webinar@ecfa.org and we'll take as many as we can at the end of our time together. But now I think, Warren, we're ready, right, to shift gears from the historic state of giving data. Let's spend a few minutes looking at what's been happening in real time in some of the recent months.
What everybody has heard so far are numbers in our annual State of Giving report based on CPA-prepared financial statements, not on estimates. That is a researcher's gold standard. Plus, all the data was limited to ECFA members, 1,919 of them that we gleaned their information from for this report at that. Next, in order to get 2020 current data, we took a real-time survey. The majority of the responses came from ECFA members, but not all. And we certainly didn't get 100% participation. But that said, we did learn a lot. Michael, you thought up the title to describe our findings from this 2020 data. So would you please introduce it?
Well, that'd be my pleasure. Yeah, in this most recent data that we've gleaned, what we're calling our bonus material that's been embedded in the ECFA State of Giving 2020, we did title that Defying the Odds, and then subtitle Giving Grows Despite the Pandemic. So like you mentioned, Warren, this actually does come from our third survey during the pandemic, those that we've taken quarterly throughout 2020, as we seek to monitor and report on how Christ-centered ministries and churches are processing all of the different financial implications of the pandemic. I don't want to get too far ahead of you, but Defying the Odds, you asked why. You know, that seemed like a really appropriate title given some of the positive financial trends. And then honestly, I'm an optimistic person, but we saw just these remarkably high levels of optimism that were expressed by churches and ministries who responded to our surveys, despite we also recognize, right, the very real challenges of this season. So that's the title. Hopefully that's helpful as we dive into what some of the biggest findings are.
In just a minute, I'm going to dive into a biggest finding, but we got another question that I think we should answer right now. We got a great team behind us. They're fielding the questions and they're feeding us the answers. This is so good. So someone says, if I want to show my board how our revenue increase over 5 years compares to your average, I'm using actual dollars. How does your inflation adjustment create a discrepancy from our numbers? And here is what one of our CPAs answered who worked on this. Using the CPI index, the Consumer Price Index, we inflation adjusted 2019 numbers to 2014 values. We then calculated the overall change and annualized that growth over a 5-year period. And by the way, there's a footnote in the report that explains this process. So for your specific situation, the rescue missions and homeless grew 25.0% over 5 years prior to adjusting for inflation. When annualizing for inflation, using the above process, the increase came down to 2.7%. All right, moving on. The biggest finding of our survey, in my opinion, is this one, that 2/3 of the 1,289 survey takers said that 2020 cash giving year to date, that is January through September, is the same or higher than 2019's for the same period. Let me say that again. Despite a global pandemic and with all the economic turmoil it represents, almost 2 in 3 nonprofits and churches are doing just as well for cash donations through September as they were last year through September. Wow.
That is a big wow. And I think that's one where when we've had questions that have come in from folks in the media maybe or others that are running stories on some of these findings, it's always the, wow, okay, help explain that. And that's just, it's been one of those amazing things that we've seen in the Lord's provision this year, one of the very, very positive findings. So drilling down though, Warren, I see that your table there breaks it down by what percent said the same, and then also what percent said that 2020 is higher. For those who said lower, I see you also asked lower by how much. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Exactly. And notice that the biggest group said lower by only 1 to 10%. So we could have titled this section 4 out of 5 when comparing 2019 to 2020 year-to-date giving said that 2020's was higher, the same, or up to 10% lower. 4 out of 5. Who would have predicted that when the pandemic kicked in? That is a blessing from God. That represents a lot of answered prayers.
Amen. You're exactly right. That is amazing. I'd say that's a true miracle. It is an answer to a lot of prayers. I guess that's one benefit of this season. I think it's had us all on our knees a little bit more. So we're grateful for that. I would say too, Warren, that related to these findings, we do recognize that this has been really one of those times of need almost like no other. So one of the things that I think too, Warren, is that people who have been able to give, those that have had capacity, that they have been faithful in continuing to give based on the needs, the very real needs of this season. They've stayed with it. And then I think, too, one of the other observations that I would have from talking to many folks is, we've just seen how ministries have adapted, how they've innovated. You used that word pivot earlier, just to keep the mission moving forward. So, I believe that those who have seen growth in giving, one other thing would be, I think they've also done a great job of communicating the impact that their ministry is having. But even again, coming back to it, like you said, Warren, even with the best of communication, these giving levels that we're seeing, they are still a miracle and a blessing for those where we've seen so much of that positive news, even though knowing it's also not exactly the same across all specters. There have been some different experiences that are out there.
Indeed. And the next slide isn't quite as rosy. We just looked at cash giving. Now, how does other revenue do for 2020 versus 2019? Not 2/3 this time, but around half said that 2020 is higher or the same as 2019. And sadly, of those who said it was not as good, take a look at the different lower columns, and you'll see that 16% said it was lower by more than 40%. Ouch. Those ministries are really hurting. For instance, think about a Christian camp that was not able to hold camps this year. It would likely report a decrease like this due to not receiving the typical camper fees. For both of these tables, we broke it down by the many ministry types that gave us a sufficient number of responses. For both tables, orphan care ministries were at the top of the list, with a very high percentage saying that 2020 was the same or higher than 2019, both for cash giving and for other revenue.
Right. And one thing, too, I see that some ministries were at different places on these two tables. So camps and conferences, for example, Warren, they seem to have strong donations, right, for 2020 compared to 2019. But also in terms of other income, unfortunately, they're at the very bottom. So it's interesting how we're seeing that.
I admire their faith and their persistence. They have had it rough. The next slide pulls together all 3 surveys we conducted during the pandemic. Every 3 months we asked, what is your outlook toward total cash gifts or donations to your church or ministry, excluding one-time extraordinary gifts, over the next 3 months? And look at the progression here. Wow. Especially among nonprofits.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we talked about that word optimism earlier, which I know we use that in some of the headlines from some of the prior surveys, but that's really what we're drilling into again here. Compared to churches, like you said, Warren, with the progression among nonprofits, they were much less optimistic back in May. Then in August, their optimism levels almost caught up to that of churches. In November, it really looks like their optimism maybe even just inched, I guess, past churches.
Indeed. And here in Table 10, once again, we broke down the nonprofits by various types of ministry. And look who's number 2. in their level of financial optimism, camps, and conferences. There's their faith. I just praise them for it. Wow. Wow. Here's another Yay God table, table 11. We ask nonprofits and churches if they've used their cash reserves. We know that for some, their cash reserves were very meager.
Right. And earlier, Warren, you said there's a table for that. I maybe could adapt that a little bit and say there's also, by the way, a great ECFA ebook for that on how to grow your cash reserves. And I know that's just one of the many ways that we want to serve all those who are listening with great resources. So anyway, sorry, I know I interrupted you there.
No, don't. I learned a lot personally when I read that ebook on cash reserves, and it's a great book to learn from. But we digress.
Right.
In this slide, we gave survey takers 3 choices about cash reserves. You didn't touch it, you used some of it, or you used all of it. And we asked the question 3 times. So the first time we asked it was, how were your cash reserves this year through September? And the majority said they hadn't touched them. Let me just repeat that sentence. The majority said they hadn't touched them. 1 in 5 had used some, and thankfully only 2% had used them all. Now, the second time period, we asked the same question about the likelihood of using cash reserves for the rest of the year. And then on the third question, we asked about using the cash reserves in 2021, whether they thought they'd need to tap the reserves. And you can see that the further into the future, the more people suspect they'll need to use some of their cash reserves. 3 more slides, all brief, and then let's go to Q&A. We ask about staffing levels. Same pattern of question. We gave them 3 choices. Increase staffing levels, keep them the same, or reduce them. And we ask about 3 time periods: year-to-date through September, the remainder of the year, and 2021 outlook. The majority kept staff the same so far this year and plan to do so for the rest of the year, but they aren't so sure for 2021. That table also gives further breakdown by different types of ministry. Now, another question, but same approach and roughly same outcome. We ask about non-staffing expenses. These responses were concerning. A sizable number reduced, eliminated, or postponed essential ministries. Ouch. But many indicate plans to maintain where they cut to or to rebuild, and especially in 2021. Sobering, but in some ways encouraging. And in some ways that kind of summarizes the whole report.
Good. No, that's I guess that's kind of a good place to make the transition now to Q&A. And I know that the report, again, it has other tables, and we could take time to talk through them. But again, it's a free download at ECFA.org. /state of giving. And so we commend that report to you, free download, share that widely. But let's get now to our Q&A. And we do have time here now at the end of the webinar. We tried to reserve some time to be sure we got to your questions, your observations. And again, you can email us at webinar@ecfa.org, or you can tweet them also to the hashtag #AskECFA. And Warren, I'll start actually with one that falls really more in the category of an observation. which I think is great because it's good to have the opportunity to learn from others and what we're experiencing, what we're seeing. That's what these surveys are all about. So this was a great, I think, couple observations that came in from someone tuning in today. It says 2 observations that I've seen. First one, those ministries that have built and maintained close relationships with partners did much better. I would totally echo that. I think one of the things, Warren, that we saw through this pandemic timeframe is just coming back to, again, the importance of the relationship, the importance of caring for the person and communication. So I think that was a great observation. And then another
just
one.
Before you go further.
Sure.
My watchword is, if you think you're communicating enough, you're not. You need to aim at over-communication. Things are changing so much. People care about your ministry. They're praying about your ministry. Let them know where you are and how they can pray, and let them walk with you through this journey. And those ministries especially that did that were the ones that seemed to retain the stronger and more consistent giving support.
Absolutely.
Over-communicate.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll tuck in another one. We did get a question from someone. It was related to just the flat nature of some of the church giving and asking, what are the different tips or suggestions? And I think, Warren, exactly what you just said in terms of communication, over-communication, those are at least some of the key elements, I think, to being sure that we're doing the best we can to help folks know what the needs are so they can be generous. And then I'll come back to...
Well, and not just, before you come back, not just what the needs are, but, the bottom line for nonprofits, including churches, is not the dollar.
Right.
It's changed lives. And the more you can show how, even during a pandemic, the giving that God is supplying through you, our generous donors, has changed this person's life, and this person's life, and this person's life, the more your donors will say, yes, 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 and we need to do more.
Yep. 100%. Totally in agreement with that. I think the impact is so important. Then I'll just come back to just the second observation again that I thought was great. And this was that people in general, if they could keep their job, had much less expense than 2019. So no or less travel, maybe in some cases less eating out. So maybe they had some more cash on hand. And so they were in a place of, in a sense, I guess, having to force stewarding their resources better. And so had more opportunities to be able to give. And so, again, I think that does come back to not just the challenges of this season, Warren, but also maybe some of the opportunities as well. So I appreciate that listener sharing some of those observations with us.
Let me deal with a quick question, one that made my day. It says, where do the wage increase percentages come from, and where do you get your sources? I put a footnote in the report to everything for where I got all the resources. And just in case we didn't give you enough detail, write to research@ecfa.org, and I will give you more details.
Good. Well, Warren, another question was, we've been talking so much about the report. We've mentioned several times that this is the annual ECFA State of Giving report. And so maybe just give quick background. The question is, where can I go to get some of the prior surveys? But maybe tell us, too, how long have we been doing this State of Giving work, and where can folks find those resources?
This is our 11th annual State of Giving report. It was an idea in the mind of then President Dan Busby, and it has grown each year, but we put all of the previous ones, at least the last 10 years worth, on the webpage. So just go to ecfa.org/State of Giving, or identically ecfa.church/State of Giving. Down at the bottom of the page, you'll see hot links to all the previous reports.
Perfect. And then a couple of questions, Warren, that came in related to PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, which I'll mention we've had some great webinars and resource on earlier this year. I know in some of the other surveys that we've done, we have tracked just generally percentage of those who've responded that got the PPP and so on and so forth. Can you talk just a little bit about what we learned in that? And then also, if the PPP loan funds were received, were they counted as revenue in your survey? Speak to that, Warren.
Wow. Okay, that's two questions. For the first one, let me encourage you to go to ecfa.org/surveys, and you can see the quarterly previous ones, and there's a date on each one on the front cover. And then just scroll through them. They're about 10 or 12 pages each, and you'll see the PPP question we ask and the percentage response that people gave. Now, for the second question about did we count PPP income in total income, I did not specify that in the survey question. I just said total income, or for churches, total giving. And so I'm going to assume that if PPP monies were received, that was counted as total income. And Michael, if you want to give a rebuttal.
No, that's great. I appreciate that, Warren. One that we might just talk through here is really a question about donor advised funds and what the possible impacts of the rise in donor advised funds and the increased usage of those. The question was, is the money that's sitting in donor advised funds or maybe being given to donor advised funds, is that skewing any of the giving trends for ECFA members versus overall giving? I know that's something that we're all closely following as a trend. So Warren, maybe you can speak to that from if the surveys within ECFA that we've done internally, but also maybe other surveys that you've seen as well. I know those are some trends that you're monitoring. Can you speak to that?
In nonprofit world, the big news is the dramatic increase in monies going to donor advised funds, known as DAFs. In nonprofit world, the big frustration by churches and nonprofits is how do we got this check from this bank, it says it's from a DAF, but how do we thank and cultivate the relationship to the donor? And that's a challenge unless the donors self-identify. So donors out there, if you're doing this, please tell your church, hey, just so you know, that was me. It was a joy. We looked at each other and said, honey, we've been saving for a rainy day. I think this is a rainy day. Let's give it to this ministry or our church. That was us behind that check. That will help people. The factoring of donor advised funds as a total piece of charitable giving, more and more charitable giving is going through that, but the tracking of it, at least national studies and all, have not really come up with clarity as to this much or this stream or who exactly those donors are.
Good. All right. Well, this next message that came in, Warren, has both a question component and then it has some observation. So for the question component, maybe we'll do a little drill here if you're up for it. And this is where I think there's maybe a good example of being able to utilize some of the tables within the State of Giving report. But the specific question would be for international nonprofits, and I'm not sure based on the tables, Warren, that we have what the best category is, but have you seen any trends in giving, whether positive or negative? And specifically, this comes from an international nonprofit that's doing development programs in developing countries. So I don't know, Warren, if you'd be able to, while I cover some of the observations, look up in the table what would be the best response there. But while you do that, I will just share some of the observations that came in as well, which were, we have seen donors respond well to clear and honest communication about the impact of the pandemic on our participants and programs. So again, communication, that really seems to be one of the key takeaways from our time together today. So appreciate that observation. And then the next observation here was, we have seen that our holistic model, because it's multifaceted, has created resilience in our participants and allowed the majority of them to adapt and to pivot. So sharing that observation in case that would be helpful for others who are listening today. And so, Warren, now that we've covered some of those great observations that came through, any response there to that question related to international nonprofits and the trends in giving, whether positive or negative?
And ECFA members are all U.S.-based, including territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. We have members. But of those that are U.S.-based, the category that you'll find in our report is going to start with the word missions, and it'll either be missions :international or missions :domestic. So, for example, Table 1 says that Missions International, 83% of their funding comes from cash giving. And then Table 2 looks at Missions International and says that their 5-year annualized increase in giving was 0%. So it was flat, as I mentioned before. So go through the reports and just look for the category missions. That's where you would be.
Perfect. See, I knew you could do it. Thanks for that drill. And Warren, maybe as we wait for a couple more questions to come through, I think another good one, and maybe this would have been helpful for us even just at the beginning to start with, is, why do we do, this sort of research at ECFA? Why is the state of giving so important? I know through the different questions and through the content today, folks can see how it's helpful, but maybe just share a little bit of also the heart behind why ECFA does this state of giving work.
Oh, that's coming to me. I thought that was El Presidente. First, ECFA has a unique perspective in that our membership is not just saying, hey, oh yes, we adhere to the 7 integrity standards, but they're saying, and we have a CPA prepared report to validate that this is how we're living out integrity in our ministry. So as a result, we're sitting on a lot of numbers, and everyone wants to know, and you may say, well, that doesn't sound very spiritual, but whether it is or isn't, this is the question on most people's mind. How are we doing relative to other ministries or churches that are sort of like us, doing the same things in the same area, with the same budget, with the same history? And we're able to give you a window on that. And we're hoping that through that, armed with that information, that enables you to have the confidence and tools to build greater trust, both on your team, and among your donors. Michael, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the other thing that I would say, Warren, too, I was just thinking about as you were sharing, is how really ECFA's standards, these core 7 standards of responsible stewardship that relate to governance, financial management, and also, fundraising or stewardship. I think about some of the great research work that you've done, too, just in all of the different areas that really tie up and into the standards that are directly related to ECFA and our mission. So I know we're preaching to the choir, a lot of the folks who are on the webinar today, you're folks that care about financial integrity and accountability, following standards like those that ECFA upholds. But Warren, one that I think of too, just another example of some of the great research and survey work that's been done that we've also helped a lot of folks with this year as we've wrestled with just some unusual and different challenges is the board members, speaking of governance, board members who are also involved in helping ministries navigate this unique season. I know some of our past research work that we've done has also been in areas related to governance. And so it's hard for me to imagine a lot of other sources where folks, I think you know my heart in saying this, but being able to find that type of information, that type of resource that really relates to our standards. And so in addition to the work that we've done on state of giving and in some of these other financial trends and areas like that, Warren, the other comment I would make is just how much I appreciate this research work that you help lead and spearhead here at ECFA that also helps us in upholding the standards that we're responsible for as well. So with that being said, are there any other questions, Warren, that you've seen that have come through?
One came in while you were talking, and I was listening attentively to your brilliant answer, but I was also looking at the scroll of questions.
Sure.
Do you think the $1,200 per person PPP, Payment Protection Program, not payment, Payroll Protection Program, had much impact on charitable giving? Well, my wife and I, that's the first thing we did. We tithed off of it, and I would like to hope that many other Christians out there said, hey, we got something. Our church is in need. Their ministry's in need. Let's give. I don't have hard data in the research, and I haven't seen others that have asked that question.
No, that anecdotal observation, Warren, I think is really helpful. And I'll tell you, even within our ECFA members, when that particular provision, came out earlier this year, I know there were some different, real intentional communication strategies, initiatives surrounding that, and just love to see how folks, who did have the capacity, again, to be able to give, use those opportunities to be generous. And so with that, that's actually a great place for us to kind of draw things to a close with Q&A on that note about generosity and what we're seeing, and really so much to be thankful for. And speaking of thanks, we just want to say thanks to our viewers for the excellent questions that you've shared today, your participation. And also, thanks for being part of this webinar community in our final webinar in a year where we've really seen record webinar impact across 2020. Warren, you're the statistician. We have seen 21,537, to be precise. We've seen over 21,000 total webinar registrations this year. We're so grateful for all who have been along with us for the journey. I'm looking across the room as well. I'm so grateful for our team that's helped make that possible. All of our webinars have been free throughout this COVID season, and they are all still available for free replay. You can visit ecfa.org/events and click the Webinars on Demand tab to have access to all of those great webinars this year. Also coming soon is the release of ECFA's 2021 Ministers Tax and Financial Guide, and also the Church and Nonprofit Tax and Financial Guide, annual resources. These easy to understand guides help simplify the tax code. They offer tax and financial advice for churches and nonprofits, and also include dozens of tips to help reduce your tax bill, which we say really helps further good stewardship. And so both books will soon be available as a free member resource, and also available this year on the ECFA website, along with a series of short videos that'll be related to the guide and to that content. We also want to say a very special thank you to those who serve our over now 2,500 ECFA member churches and ministries. On behalf of all of us here at ECFA, I can say it is our honor each day to get to serve you as you faithfully carry out the Great Commission with excellence and integrity, even despite the challenges that we've walked through in this season. If your organization is not yet an ECFA member and you're ready to join these leading ministries that have taken a stand for integrity and access the many benefits of ECFA membership, many of which we've covered today, you can visit the link on your screen to get started with the easy online application. Well, our time has now come to a close for today's ECFA webinar on the ECFA State of Giving 2020. We hope this has been meaningful to you. You'll be receiving another email shortly with today's PowerPoint slides, a copy of the State of Giving report, and a link to the recording as well. And again, I'd like to thank especially Dr. Warren Byrd for his presentation and helping us oversee this excellent research, and to each person who joined us today for this webinar. May God continue to bless you in your ministry with a joyous Christmas season and a strong finish to 2020.
Amen.